Hi everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to the 10th Masterclass of the India Forum for Nature-Based Solutions Masterclass series. I'm Shaurya Malla and I support the Secretariat for the forum. Before we begin, wanted to give a quick introduction to the forum as well. The forum is a coalition of research, practice, and finance organizations working together to scale up the adoption of NBS to shape climate resilient cities and communities across India. Through knowledge exchanges like this masterclass series, we aim to share actionable strategies and insights that support practitioners, policymakers, and researchers interested in implementing NBS on the ground. So, today's session focuses on a timely and urgent theme restoring urban lakes as critical systems for climate resilience and water security. As Indian cities face mounting pressures from climate change, rapid urbanization, and water stress, our urban lakes, once central to local ecosystems and community life, have become some of the most threatened spaces. However, they are also offer one of the most powerful nature-based solutions for building urban resilience. So, in this masterclass, we will explore how lakes can be reimagined not just as scenic or recreational features, but as dynamic ecological assets that regulate water flows, recharge groundwater, reduce flood risks, moderate urban heat, and also anchor social and cultural connections. At the heart of today's session is a structured five-stage lake rejuvenation framework developed by Well Labs and Friends of Lakes with support from the Bruhat Bengaluru Mahanagar Palike. This framework brings together scientific diagnostics, community perspectives, and systems thinking, offering a replicable model for cities across India. We are delighted to welcome our speakers today from Well Labs who have been closely involved in developing this framework. First, we have Anam Husain. Anam is an urban regeneration specialist with over 4 years of experience at the intersection of ecology, infrastructure, and social equity. Her work focuses on water sensitive urban design, blue green infrastructure, and ecologically grounded planning. Anam has led multidisciplinary projects that embed nature based solutions into public infrastructure, ranging from stormwater drain rejuvenation and lake restoration to watershed planning and inclusive public space design. Joining her is Deepthi Nagappa. Deepthi is a senior research associate with the Urban Water Program at Well Labs. Her work explores the role of emerging technologies in supporting urban environmental management. With a strong focus on water quality, she works on improving resource recovery in decentralized water reuse and sanitation systems, and also has been closely involved in lake management and water reuse efforts in and around Bengaluru. And finally, we have Rashmi Kulranjan, who is a hydrologist with the Urban Water Program. Rashmi, in her role, focuses on sectoral water demand and the hydrology and water quality of urban lakes. Her research is rooted in extensive fieldwork across Bengaluru's lake networks, with a particular interest in understanding human induced changes to water systems. A very warm welcome to all three of you, and thank you for joining us today. So before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping notes to the audience. We will have a dedicated Q&A segment following the presentation. So please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box throughout the session. And the session is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube. And a link will also be shared with all registered participants for the recording via email. With that, let's dive into the presentation. I now invite our speakers to take us through their work. Thank you.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Um, Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join today's session. As Shaurya mentioned, I'm Deepthi, and we're very happy to present our attempt towards a framework for lake rejuvenation. So let's begin. This is a draft framework that we worked on last year with Friends of Lakes, which is a citizen-led initiative for lakes in Bengaluru, and the engineers in the Bruhat Bengaluru Mahanagar Palike. The framework itself was funded by DCB Bank with our collaboration with, and once the framework was developed, it was also made public and presented in different forums, such as this one. And we've now received responses and feedback to the framework itself from over 180 people. This has also led to a signing of the MOU with the NIUA And we're really looking forward to embedding these guidelines into Mahua and get them institutionalized. We're also, along with making the framework itself, we're also testing it out in a pilot project in Malapalli, which is a lake in Chintamani in Chikballapura district in Karnataka. Um, Along with that, with our ongoing collaboration with WRI, we've also launched the framework as part of a summary document for a site engineer's guide to implementing blue-green infrastructure in Bengaluru. This is along with the climate action cell of the BBMP, and we're working towards making it a full-fledged SOP so that it's actually useful for the people on ground to apply the framework, and of course, for it to be participatory in its formation and for it to be iterative in the way that we consider different sites and the nuances and the specificities of these different places. So with that, we can start with why we need a framework to begin with. So we can move, yes. So we first look at there being, or the need for preparing a framework in the first place came with a mismatch between the output and the outcome. It also came because of a lack of consensus or a way of not being able to arrive at what a particular goal for a particular lake's function should be. There were also issues of lack of standards in both the design and the O&M aspects of making sure that the lake performs its functions. And there were issues of attribution as to what makes a particular lake actually perform that function, who has been involved, who's been a stakeholder, and who can be attributed to either it's functioning well or malfunctions. So diving deep into each of these, when we first look at the mismatch between the outputs and the outcomes, sorry, Anam, I think we skipped a few slides. One, yes, thank you. So when we look at what we mean by outputs and outcomes, outputs are really the assets that are associated with particular lakes. Now, they could be inlet pipes, they could be outlet channels or waste spheres, but really focusing on installation of certain outputs didn't necessarily lead to a desired outcome. For example, having a sluice gate would help us manage water levels within the lake, but it really depends on whether the sluice gate is located correctly. It's designed to carry the capacity of runoff that's expected in the lake's catchment. And when the output itself, the assets themselves, didn't really lead to desired functions or the outcomes, that's when we thought we need to have scientific principles being embedded in the process of lake rejuvenation, in the process of lake rejuvenation itself. Now, coming to the stakeholders who play a very important role in understanding or determining what really the role or the function a lake can probably play, or multiple functions that a lake can play in its catchment for its surrounding neighborhoods. We know that multiple stakeholders, especially for example, in a lake in Bangalore, you have multiple stakeholders at different levels. So you have the public, where you have joggers, cyclists, senior citizens who really engage with the recreational aspects or the recreational functions the lake can perform. You also have livelihood grazers whose source of income really depends on how well the lake is doing. You also have municipal and state level authorities who are involved in different aspects of regulating, maintaining, and ensuring that the lake is doing well. So in Bangalore, you have, for example, the solid waste and the stormwater department being separate, including the horticulture department, for example, being separate heads within the BBMP, for example, when it comes to uh, custodianship of the lake. But when it comes to the water entering the lake, you have the BWSSB. When it comes to its quality, you have the KSPCB. So multiple agencies donning multiple hats and coming in different aspects of the process or different parts of the process of the lake rejuvenation process itself. So consensus or building consensus or coming to a conclusion as to which particular function a lake can or cannot perform can sometimes be a tug of war between perhaps core assets for regulatory functions or even benefits in terms of functional goals, reducing risks, maximizing benefits, but can also be a tug of war between the aesthetics and the recreational aspects, which so far we found or we observed were the ones being focused on when it comes to goal setting and stakeholder consensus for lake rejuvenation projects. Moving on, when we talk about the lack of standardization, we see it sort of being applicable across the scale. So one way where we don't have standards for designing these assets, understanding which of them are required where and for what particular functions, standards for construction or operational standards. When we don't have a reference or a benchmark, what happens is that even though there is work and there is a lot of effort, particularly happening in these lakes, you sometimes have consequences that no one really, that are undesired, and sometimes, it's no one's fault. For example, in a lake called Masandra in Bengaluru, what has happened is that the inlet is located at an elevation lower than the outlet. And when it rained, for example, last year, I think it was in last September, uh, typically you would see the outlet flooding. And in this case, because of the difference in the elevation levels themselves, you see the inlet flooding and the water backflowing, which is really a civil engineering challenge, or really an implementation aspect of what the difference in elevation levels should be between the inlet of a lake and its outlet, so that we ensure, one, that the flood control function of a lake is being performed, particularly once it's identified that that's an issue, and two, that it's able to channelize water, especially in extreme rainfall events or heavy rainfall events that are becoming more and more prevalent in our cities. Now, coming to the standardization or the aspect of water quality, what we refer to for assessments are really this discrete classification systems that the CPCB, or the Central Pollution Control Board, has for the best designated use for a surface water body. Now, of course, we use that across rivers and lakes, and but what we really get is a discrete class of use cases or uses that the lake can perform, and not necessarily a scale or an incremental way of tracking whether or not improvements in the lake water quality are really outcomes or really consequences of the lake rejuvenation effort itself. Now, sometimes, at least when we set goals here, we see that a lot of the aspiration is around taking the lake from class D or class E to a class C, or sometimes for the peri-urban lakes to even making it a class A, a drinking water lake, which means really having pretty pristine water, pretty pristine catchment conditions. But the scale or the ladder itself doesn't really function that way. And when we move to the next slide, you'll see that the ladder is broken, right? So you have certain parameters that don't really scale across. So certain parameters like EC and sodium absorption ratio are really particular to industrial reuses or for irrigation, and ammonia for ecological, and they do make sense for discrete classifications. But ones that are also tracking, for example, the DO, the BOD, the total coliform levels, they don't necessarily help us track incremental changes, which probably one project of lake rejuvenation, one effort over 1 year is able to do, and not necessarily move across classes, but really move incrementally, become a little better within the class itself. Going to the next slide. Now, another aspect of lake rejuvenation projects is really understanding them or giving them the due credit of seeing them as complex, large projects where we're looking at different aspects of the lake itself. Now, we have come up with our own classification system, which my colleagues will take you through. But essentially, it's to say that the lake is a complex socio-biological ecosystem which has different components that need to be treated differently. One way of doing that, or an attempt to do that, is to begin ascetizations of lakes. With ascetization, what we really mean is that we're able to break down the lake rejuvenation project in and of itself into various components, where you break down the lake into different classes of assets or different types of assets required for the lake to perform a particular function, and then you're able to then work on that particular asset to make sure that that works well ultimately contributing to the lake performing its function. Now, why do we need to even ascetize? We find that it's a useful framework to think and to be able to determine which assets are required to achieve a particular function. We're able to also do an asset baseline, which really serves as a checklist to enable first better O&M and also eventually, or over the years, better monitoring and evaluation. They also help us in standardizing designs for assets. And really, they also help in financialization, channeling finances, and enabling ease of attribution. Overall, we do think it's a good mechanism to have better governance and better and more focused community engagement. Going to the next slide. Now, particularly about the financialization and ease of attribution aspects of assetizing lakes, the idea is really to be able to also then unlock funding, not only for the rejuvenation of one particular lake, but really for particular assets within the lake itself, either through ESG or through socio or through corporate environmental responsibility, to be able to say that these are the different assets. Maybe a particular donor could fund a particular one of them and really be responsible for them to be implemented for their performance and for their continued operations. What it also does when we look at financing lake rejuvenation projects in this way is also give us an ease of attributing and not really stick to, for example, the meter cube number of how much water was stored, but really how well that asset is doing, and ultimately leading to how well the lake is doing. So, keeping all of these things in mind, we need a science-based framework as really a starting point so that the lakes that are under rejuvenation or being considered for rejuvenation can perform their appropriate role. For our framework, we'd like to delineate our scope. We first start with lakes that are urban and peri-urban, located in peninsular India, but it does not include coastal lakes. As you know, they behave differently and have different considerations to be made at the outset. We've also considered shallow lakes that are less than 6 meters deep. And in terms of the sources of pollution into these lakes, we've considered domestic and municipal sources and have particularly excluded industrial ones in this iteration of the framework, just because as we all know, handling these pollutants requires a different approach. Now, when we go to the components of the framework itself, it's really divided into 5. First is the diagnosis and the visioning step, where we try to bridge community aspirations with the scientific principles of diagnosing what the problem is, particularly for that lake. The second, and to arrive at the functions that that lake can perform. The second is design, where once we know that a particular lake would perform XYZ function, we'd like to then design assets and the lake's assets to be able to perform these functions. The third is implementation, where we look at once the goal is set, once the design is ready, we really look to implementation as per design and have various checklists or checks and balances in place so that that happens. The fourth is operations and maintenance, where we're really looking at assets being operated at a desired level and maintenance to be continuous. The fifth and the final one for now is monitoring and evaluation, where we continuously check if the lake is meeting its targets. Now, there are also different feedback and feedback loops and feed-forward loops in this whole framework, but we'll get into that a little later. The idea of these components of the framework really is to bridge community participation, community aspirations with scientific principles, so that we account for lakes performing certain functions within the catchment, but also to be responsive to the requirements of the local community there. The process is also set up in such a way so that it becomes more accessible to someone who's probably not so familiar with lake rejuvenation projects, in order to streamline it and increase transparency along the way. For today's presentation and this iteration of the framework, we'll be focusing on 3 components: the diagnosis and visioning, which Anam will be presenting, the design, which Rashmi will be presenting, and the monitoring and evaluation, for which I'll come back. The audience for this framework really is multiple, and we really see them coming in and we hope they find value in different sections, like you saw earlier. But really, the target groups are government officials who are involved in lake rejuvenation projects, donors and funders who have been funding them, but might also want some support in terms of understanding what the impact has been of these projects. Technical experts who really come in the design section, for example, and the monitoring and evaluation parts, and citizens really for whom the lake is an everyday experience, and we hope that they find that there are multiple places where we would need their lived experiences and their expertise to come in. We now begin with the diagnosis and visioning, and I'll ask Anam to please continue.
Thank you. So this is the first stage of the whole process of lake rejuvenation, and it's a very preliminary stage where we are collaborating the data-driven aspects of lake rejuvenation and also integrating it with the community aspirations. And so it becomes like the first stage to even understand what should happen within the whole process of the lake. And this is where this is a process, this is the stage of the whole lake rejuvenation where we would not require advanced technical expertise. This is something that can be done by the consultants or even the communities that are living around the lake. So let's go into like what would be the step-by-step process of doing this stage particularly. So first we start with the catchment level risk analysis. This is where we assess the larger catchment level risk, and then we kind of like zoom into like what are the issues that the catchment is actually facing. So when we look at the larger catchment level risk, this is where we are understanding, where we are collating the primary and secondary data to understand what are the higher risks that are coming, and then we are actually going inside, zooming into the lake surroundings and identifying factors that might determine what a function the lake can perform or will not be able to perform. Then we map the stakeholders that are living around the lake, and we try to understand the kind of activities they are doing and wish to do. Then we hold a lake visioning workshop. This is where we present our scientific findings to the community and have open discussions with them. Then we finally consolidate all of these findings into a lake visioning document. And this document will contain the prioritized functions of the lake. And this document will then be further given for preparing the RFPs or for floating the tenders. So as we said that the first stage is to get the prioritized functions of the lake. So, but what are the functions that a lake can play? So a lake can help in groundwater recharge, so allowing the surface water runoffs to actually enter the earth. A lake could also help control flooding, allowing excess rainfall to flow inside the lake while keeping the neighborhood hazard free. And the lake can also can also provide indirect potable recharged water, and it can also support a lot of ecological functions, that it can host a lot of biodiversity, and also it can become a vibrant social and cultural space, providing an area of recreational activities to the community. So these are some of the 5 functions that a lake can perform. So let's understand the first stage a little in detail. This is a matrix that we have prepared because we understand that a lake doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a larger water catchment system, and it can face multiple challenges. And this stage helps analyze these risks by the degree of their severity. So we have developed this matrix where we categorize this risk across all of these dimensions that we have mentioned over here. And what we have done is we have made a checklist of the secondary data that we need to collect and the primary data that we need to collect. And once we do all the checking of those data, the matrix basically gives us is the flooding a higher risk, or is the groundwater scarcity is a higher risk, etc. So this is how we understand the larger catchment level risk through this. Then we step into the second step, which is basically looking into what are the land uses and what that can actually, what are the surroundings of the lake that can actually inhibit or aid the functioning of a lake. As we understand that there are multiple functions a lake can perform, but actually not every lake can perform all of the functions. So these are some of the factors that we have gauged. So one is whether the lake has an inlet and outlet connection. whether it sits in a recharge zone or not. And third, how much control over the water quality we have, whatever water is entering inside the lake. So these are all the three factors that we need to understand if the lake will able to mitigate the risk that we have already understood in the first step. So just to simplify it, let's see it via this matrix. So for instance, if a lake has to perform, if the risk is flooding and it has to perform a function of flood control, we need to make sure that catchment connectivity is there. So that becomes a very critical factor. Second instance is, for example, if the lake is supposed to be used for some socio-cultural aspects where the community wants to have some contact or non-contact based activity within the lake. So control over the water quality that is entering the lake becomes a desired characteristic that we would need. In step 3 is where we move on to understanding who are the stakeholders of the lake, who has a say for the lake. And this is where we understand that we have local communities, we have government bodies, and we have citizen groups who all play a very critical role in understanding the socio-economic value of the lake. So this is where we have a preliminary discussion with the stakeholders, and we also present them our scientific findings that we had from the first 2 stages, so that they're able to understand that these are our aspirations, but these are also the limitations of the lake. Then we have a very interactive process, which is a lake visioning workshop. This is where we bring together all the stakeholders and we present them our findings, and we have open discussions with them. And we take inputs from all the stages. So first is the catchment risk analysis. So we present them that, see, these are the risks that are happening in your catchment area. And then we also tell them that these are the factors that actually limit this particular lake to perform that function, or it actually helps this lake to perform these functions. Then we combine them with the stakeholder aspirations and the desired functions that they have, and we come up with a prioritized functioning of the lake. So this is basically just understanding what are the urgent needs of the lake. So for example, this also helps in phasing out the project if a funding is coming. So we're able to understand that this is the urgent prioritized need of the lake and it can perform. So the first phase of the funding goes to that particular function. And this is just an example of how the output of these all these steps would look like. So just for instance, say that the groundwater scarcity is a higher risk in this area. And then we say, okay, can this lake perform this function or not? Because if, for example, if it's sitting in the recharge zone or not. And does the stakeholder identify this as a high priority? So this kind of becomes like, then we start doing a ranking of these functions. And this is a very preliminary stage. This is not where we have done a detailed baseline study of the lake itself. This is just to set out the functions of the lake. And then the last stage is basically synthesis. This is where we consolidate all our findings and put everything we have learned through all of the steps into a lake visioning document. This isn't actually just a report. It's actually a common agreement that ensures that everyone is on the same page. And it is essential that it is made available in local language as well, so that the entire community can stay informed and engaged. The last part is where we have kind of collated a structure for a lake vision document, so that it basically streamlines the process for whoever is the PMU sitting in the department to assess various lake vision documents. So the next stage is design, and I would like to invite Rashmi to take you over through that stage.
Thanks, Anam. So like how Anam said, once we have prioritized the functions that the lake or the catchment requires based on both scientific assessment and what the community aspirations are, we would then go on to deciding how do you design the lake to serve that particular function. And this we would do it through a very step-by-step process again, like the previous step. And here we would get more of consultants who would come in and do this step, and people from technical expertise who could look at each of the lake's characteristics and the assets and ensure that they are following a particular criteria or not. And the step-by-step approach that we are suggesting that they could take is first to start off with is looking at the lake characteristics itself. which are inherent characteristics of the lake, or the natural biophysical laws which help the lake perform a particular function. So we would go into the details of this in the following slides. The other thing that we would also look at is the man-made structures, or what we call the assets that are installed in the lake. And we would try to see what are the different assets that are usually present in an urban or peri-urban lake through this process of asset listing. Then the next step would be, once you know these are the different assets that a lake needs, how do you start designing these assets so that it can perform a particular function? The last step would be to try and do an baselining for the assets. Just to also mention that in the lake characteristics, you would be doing a baselining for the natural characteristics of the lake, and here you would be doing a baselining for the man-made structures of the lake. And all of these would become inputs that would go into a typical DPR that is prepared, in addition to the usual stuff that is already there. So going to the next step, next slide. So we want to see what can be done to that is, as I mentioned, each lake has these different naturally present lake characteristics. Along with that, we also have these man-made structures which are installed into the lakes, which are called the assets. And together, what they do is it enhances the natural functions of the lake. Functions being the same what Anam was mentioning earlier, whether it be groundwater recharge, flood control, indirect potable reuse, ecological functions, or socio-cultural functions. Going to the next slide. We would start with understanding what are these natural lake characteristics. Why we wanted to understand this was because all the baseline studies that you want to do, all the monitoring that we would do after the rejuvenation is done, would be based on how, what are these lake characteristics and how they function before and after the rejuvenation. So we have divided these lake characteristics into three thematic areas. One is lake hydrology, second is lake chemistry, and the third is lake biology. Next slide. So first, what we try to do is created this simple matrix where we are trying to map the different characteristics to the different functions. Just to give an example, if groundwater recharge is the function that you would want the lake to play, two important characteristics you would want to look at is lake hydrology, which looks at all the quantity of water that's coming in terms of flows or the volume that's held in the lake. The other thing you would want to look at is lake chemistry, which is the water quality aspects. Similarly, if you're looking at flood control, lake hydrology becomes the most important characteristics that you would look at. Next slide. So once we did the mapping, which was a high-level understanding of how do you look at the functions along with the characteristics, we thought of looking at it into a little more detail, where we wanted to ask for each characteristic, we wanted to ask certain questions which may be important while trying to understand the current condition of the lake. So one of the questions in under the lake hydrology characteristics that we came up with is the lake able to temporarily hold water during an extreme rainfall event so that it can prevent damage to the surrounding area? And for that, what we understood is some of the important things that we need to look at are the water levels in the lake itself. So we would start off with the different levels, which is the lake bed level, which is the lowermost level in a lake. Then you have the ecological water levels, minimum water level that you would require in a lake to sustain any kind of life form. Then you have the full tank level, which is the maximum level in a normal condition that the lake should get filled up to, beyond which it starts overflowing. Then you have the maximum water level. This is in a very heavy rainfall event. This is the water level up to which the water can be filled in a lake. Then the last one is the tank bund level, which is the highest level in a lake. And the gap between the tank bund level and the maximum water level becomes your free board or the safety zone. Now, why it is important to understand is based on which function you would want the lake to play, whether be flood control or ecological, you would have to vary the water levels, both seasonally and temporally. So why we are saying that is that would ensure that the different functions are being able to play. So if you have to maintain ecological functions, you would have to ensure that the water level stays above ecological water levels. And if you have to maintain flood control functions, you would have to maintain it below maximum water levels. And this would ensure that the lake is also structurally intact. Going to the next characteristic, where we're looking at lake biology, where we would have to ensure that the lake has different zonations. This would be important so that it can sustain different forms of life. For example, you would have the littoral zone, which supports emergent plants, submerged plants, or floating plants. Then you have a pelagic zone, which is the much deeper zone, or the open water area, where you have most of the fishes and invertebrates settle. And then you have the benthic zone, which is at the bottom of the lake, where you would also have sediments. And here you would have organisms like benthic fishes and other microorganisms like bacteria and fungi growing. So these, each of these zones become important when you have to enhance the sustenance of each of these different organisms. Then the next characteristics that we were looking at is the lake chemistry. Yeah. So here first question we wanted to look at is what is coming into the lake and how does it affect the lake's ability to perform these different functions. So we're saying in the type of inflows coming into a lake would typically vary across the seasons. For example, in a dry season, you can get inflows like your treated wastewater coming in, or your untreated black and gray water coming in, or gray water or septic tank effluents coming in. While in a monsoon condition, you would have, in addition to all of this, you would have surface runoff coming in from the catchment itself, or sewer overflows, or even upstream flows in a system like Bangalore, where you have cascading lakes. And it is important to understand these different types of inflows and their characteristics, because it determines the quantity of water that's coming in as well as the load, so that we can determine what kind of function the lake can play, as well as what kind of intervention would be required in case the load is too high or too low. The next characteristic we wanted to look, same under lake chemistry, is the assimilative capacity of the lake. So what is being retained in the lake once it enters? So every time a pollution load comes in, and if it is below the assimilative capacity of a lake, which means by natural processes like plant uptake, absorption, dilution, and other processes which are listed in the slide, the lake is able to handle the load. But if the pollution load is higher than the assimilative capacity, that it would lead to the lake starting to deteriorate, which would mean you start seeing harmful algae growing in the lake, you have fish kill, bird kills, or the hypoxia happening in the lake. So this would help us understand what is the natural assimilative capacity of the lake itself, and what kind of, again, interventions would be required in case we want to modify this. The next slide, Anam. So once we have all of the lake characteristics, once we went through it, the questions that we asked would actually become would lead to understanding what are the different parameters that we need to study as part of the baseline. Similarly, once that we have not listed it out right now, but because it would come up again in the monitoring and evaluation chapter when Deepthi takes you through that. So those are the lake characteristics. Now we would look at the assets that are present, or the human-made structures that are being put into these lakes. Now there are different locations where we would put these assets, and they each perform different purposes. For example, some of the assets that you find inside the lake would be your inlet pipe, the sedimentation pond, the bund, or the lake bed itself. And some of the assets that you find outside are at the inlet side, you would find things like the debris trap, the STPs, the diversion drains. All of these sort of help with managing the water quality. And you would also have some other assets at the outlet. Next slide. Which is the weir or your sluice gates, which help manage the water quantity aspects of it. And once we know all of these different assets would perform different roles, that's why we wanted to start mapping it out and seeing which would be required for what function. The next slide. So we have created a flowchart. We have tried to map each of the functions that we earlier mentioned that the lake can play, and what are the different assets that would be required for the lake to play this. For example, there are some common assets which run across all the different functions that a lake would want to play. These are the basics: the inlets, the outlets, the bund, lake bed, silt trap, waste weir. These are the bare minimum that every lake will require. In addition to that, if the lake has to play a particular function, for example, if it has to play flood control, it would require sluice gates, which is going to help in controlling the water that's coming into the lake and going out of the lake. Then if the lake has to perform something between groundwater recharge, indirect potable reuse, or ecological functions, which are water quality sensitive, they would require water quality improvement assets, like you have your sewage treatment plants, constructed wetland, your diversion drains, taking it to an STP, things like that. And then you also, for ecological functions specifically, you would have to create specific habitats within the lake. And for socio-cultural purposes, you would require assets which would support recreation as well as livelihood activities like your toilets, walking paths, the drinking water setup, the street furniture, and stuff like that. And all of these assets, you could decide between the different assets based on what would help you, like Deepthi had mentioned, maximizing your benefits while minimizing the risk that the lake has. Going to the next one. So once we know that what are the different assets that your lake needs, we went into seeing how do you start designing these lakes. As Deepthi had mentioned, there are no standards existing for design and operation of these lakes. So we have tried to collate it from different places. For water quality, quantity assets, we try to get it from the Indian Standard Code. And for water quality assets, we have looked at literature and other documents which specified what would be appropriate, what would be the different water quality standards which would be appropriate for each function. And in terms of IS standard codes, usually it would be present, the typical ones that are present are for reservoirs, but not really for lakes, which are much smaller in size, for urban and peri-urban areas. And we have tried to extract that from both literature and these IS standard codes. Just to give an example of the different, like we told you about the list of different assets that are there, we're just going to show you some examples of what are the design criteria that were required to keep in mind while we are having this lake rejuvenation projects. So we have also considered lake bed as one of the assets because this is something that is modified during a rejuvenation process. And it does change how the lake would be able to play a particular function. So for example, if we are saying a lake bed could have a gentle slope, which you can see on the left, this would help maximize the ecological functions in a lake. Then you also have the deeper, flatter zone, which would maximize the surface area as well as the volume. That's why helping you maximize flood control and recharge functions. And based on what you would prioritize in the first step for your diagnosis and visioning step, you could play around with the numbers and increase or decrease the percentage of area which comes under what kind of slope. Whether if you are trying to maximize ecological functions, you would have more of the lake bed area with a gentle slope. And if you want to maximize flood control or recharge, you would maximize the area which is more flatter and deeper so that it can hold much more water and for longer. Similar, and you would have these different depths which are ideal for different conditions also. Similarly, for different assets, like here we have the weir, you would have to have a certain width, certain length, slope based on what materials you're using. We are showing only examples here, but at the end of the presentation, there is a QR code which you can scan which takes you to a link with a much more detailed presentation of each asset. Going to the next one, this is water quantity related assets. Similarly, we did for water quality, where we were looking at based on the different types of inputs, like I mentioned earlier. Based on the type of inputs, you would choose what kind of asset you would require. For example, if you're getting untreated or partially treated sewage, you could have an interception and diversion drain taking the sewage to a wastewater treatment and nutrient removal plant. And from there, the treated water then enters the lake. And if you have a slightly less inflow with slightly less loading, for example, from surface runoff, you could just send it through a sedimentation pond and a basic wetland, and then let it enter the lake. These are useful in cases where the loadings are less. And while in cases where the loadings are higher, you would go to the next slide, where you would you can put up a structure like an STP, which is typically less than 1 MLD. This can be placed inside the boundary of the lake. So there are 4 steps. Most of you may be familiar with these 4 steps, which are typical to an STP, where you have the preliminary treatment, where you have a form of screening, where you remove the solids and floating stuff. Then you have the primary treatment, where you're separating the solids and and the liquids. Then you send it to the secondary treatment where you have the biological reactions happening to reduce pollutant load. Then you have a tertiary or the polishing treatment. And finally, the water gets sent to the lake. So you could choose between the acids depending on what kind of inflows you're getting. And similarly, there are other options. For example, you have constructed wetlands or floating wetlands for which we have given the design criteria. The next one would be the asset baselining. Uh, Once we know what are the assets we require, what are the designs we need to follow, we would go on the ground and see, okay, what are the assets present in the lake itself. So this is a simple checklist we have created where we say, okay, this is the list of assets that we need. Does the lake, based on what function you choose, does it require this asset or not? If you choose yes, then you would have to check if the asset is already present in the lake or not. If it's present, you would have, if it's not present, you would obviously have to construct it. If it's present, you will have to look at what is the condition of the asset in the current scenario. If it's fine, then you don't have to make any changes. But if it's damaged, oversized, undersized, you will have to make your observations and then fill out the details of why is it not meeting the design criteria. For example, we showed the stables in the previous slides. If maybe the slope is not right or the length or width of the weirs are not right, which may cause the asset to not perform well, that could be noted down in this baselining section. And then you can decide what would be the next step that needs to be taken during the lake rejuvenation process. And yeah, this brings to the end of the design chapter, and we move to the monitoring and evaluation part.
Now we're in the fifth stage of the process, the M&E section. Here, what we're doing is trying to move away from the traditional approach of looking at only the meter cube number of what could be the impact of a lake rejuvenation project and move to more of a consolidated KPI where we consider all three aspects of lake hydrology, lake chemistry, and biology to understand, to integrate these essential characteristics comprehensively. In the monitoring aspect, particularly, we have two types in the next slide. So first is the basic monitoring, where citizen science and the use of field test kits really is prevalent. Observational data of how the asset is doing, of how the lake health seems to be. At a frequency, really, the frequency is suggested here, but it can go up, particularly when you have a more engaged community surrounding the lake. The next category is the advanced monitoring, where you would need specialized trained personnel with facilities for laboratory analysis to really go back to the questions we've asked in the baselining for the lake itself, and see how well the lake is performing across these questions, across certain parameters in these characteristics, in these key characteristics. So looking into the basic monitoring itself, and the connection really between that and the advanced monitoring, citizens, once they observe, go through the checklist and identify any particular or critical issues, then they can already contact the custodians of the lake and initiate an advanced monitoring process, which might not necessarily be part of their routine monitoring plan. Moving to the next particular aspects of the asset survey. Similarly to what Rashmi had showed, we're really looking at what the current state that can be observed by citizens, any issues that can be flagged by them across different assets located in a particular lake. For the assets themselves and for the water quality, when we move to the next slide, we're really trying to look at if there's the presence of any algal or macrophyte blooms, if there's the presence of scum, if there are fish and bird kills reported, and if there's any debris or garbage that's thrown in different parts of the lake. And really what we're trying to do is understand what the current state is. Are there any particular observations related to these, compare it to the desired state, and really try and see what the gap is between the current and the desired. Moving to the advanced monitoring, we're really, this is really a continuation of what would have happened in the baseline, where we are asking questions particular to the lake characteristics. So in hydrology, we'd ask, is the lake able to temporarily hold water during extreme rainfall events to prevent damage to the lake and its surroundings? And is it getting inflow throughout the year? And these questions are really answered by different data types and different parameters that are that are classified as either mutable or immutable. In the M&E section, what really changes is that we take a look. We have the baseline already. We take a look at the current state, post-rejuvenation, and compare and figure out where the gap is from the current to the desired. Similarly, for lake chemistry, if you remember the diagram, similarly for lake biology, we're really trying to understand if the lake is appropriately zoned, particular to the function, if the filling cycles relate to the macrophyte growth cycles, and if the lake has enough nesting and roosting sites for small and large birds, for amphibians, try and understand what the current state is. Moving on to the lake chemistry aspects, the questions we ask are really about what's coming into the lake and what's being retained, and how do both these aspects affect the ability of that lake to perform particular functions. Again, these questions go through different data types, through different parameters, and assessing what the current state is. All of this also relates to what we currently have in terms of the CPCB standards, particularly for lake chemistry. When we go to the next slide, what we have are currently the standards for designated best use to assess water quality. But like we already mentioned, this ladder is broken, and we don't really have a way of incrementally understanding what are the improvements or what are the changes in the lake water quality itself as an outcome of the lake rejuvenation process. So what we've done now is really propose what a lake water quality scale in the next slide, which helps you to track incremental changes, and it uses parameters that are pertinent to monitor issues of lake eutrophication, sewage pollution in lakes, and does not necessarily focus on near surface water bodies like the one we have. So we're presenting the scale to you now, and really to go through it in the next slide. One by one, for example, the parameters that we have considered, like suspended solids, dissolved oxygen before sunrise, the nitrogen level, the nitrate levels, which we know nitrogen and phosphorus as major contributors to eutrophication, dissolved oxygen as an indicator of how healthy the lake itself is, of the life forms that it can support. Total suspended solids as a proxy for the turbidity, really the light penetration in a particular lake, and focusing on fecal coliform as opposed to total coliform, which really is a more accurate indicator for sewage pollution. When you see the scale itself also goes from the worst to the best conditions, and at certain sections of the scale, you see it relating to different functions that the lake can perform. So you can see the first is the ecological function to the top left. And as you move a little towards the better side of the scale, we can also consider indirect potable reuse, and moving a little more further along, when these parameters are met, we can also consider more sensitive use cases where contact with the lake water itself, for example, swimming, can also be assessed. So this, again, the scale is also available. We would request you to please go through it and let us know if you have any feedback about it. But really, we come towards from taking all of this, going to the next slide, we really come towards the end of our presentation, where you see the 5 different stages. But now that we know in the M&E section that this is the current and this is the desired, what do we do if it doesn't match? So from the monitoring and evaluation, the first step is really to go back to the operations and maintenance to see if the assets are being operated at a desired level. If we find that then that's in place, then we go back to the design to see if it was actually designed so that the assets can achieve or help the lake achieve a target function. If we find that that's also in place, then we go to the implementation stage, where we really see if the implementation was as per design. These are the different ways in which different sections of the framework itself feed forward and feed into each other, or feed back into each other. And overall, we're really trying to assess if a particular lake, if the functions are set well with consensus through participation, And what are the scientific metrics or the parameters or indicators to tell that that function is being primarily met or not? With that, we really come to the end of the presentation, and we really like to call you to co-create the framework with us. In the next slide, you'll find the QR code to the draft version that's out on our website. And we really invite your feedback, your input. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. I'll hand it back to Shaurya now. But thank you all for taking the time.
Thank you for that insightful and richly layered presentation, going from the need for assetization of the lake to defining the components to the monitoring evaluation part. The framework definitely builds a compelling case for lake rejuvenation, bringing in a systems lens, but also shows us how science, design, and community aspirations can converge meaningfully. Now let's move on to the Q&A segment. The first question we have, in Bengaluru's case, which is the primary government authority that has to float an RFP to prepare a DPR for lake rejuvenation, or let's say float a tender to actually execute the rejuvenation of the lake. In case there are multiple government authorities involved, how could this possibly be done in an integrated approach? Please feel free to unmute and answer. Anam, Deepthi.
I'm just trying to find the question.
Sorry, Anam, do you want to go ahead?
I'm just trying to find the question on the chat.
It's in the Q&A section.
Sorry, could you just repeat it? I'm not able to find it.
Sure. So in the case of Bangalore, which is the primary government authority, if it has to float an RFP to prepare a DPR for lake rejuvenation, or float a tender to actually execute the rejuvenation lake. So in case there are multiple government authorities involved, how could this possibly be done in an integrated approach, is the question.
So this is what we have been facing, not just in Bangalore, but other states also when we're trying to rejuvenate the lake, because there are multiple departments that are involved, and they do not have a very straight process or a streamlined process for even assessing like what do they need from the lake rejuvenation. So this is exactly why we put on this framework where we have made sure that these are the steps that you have to follow. So if each department has the steps that has to be followed, and this is the kind of lake visioning document you will be receiving from multiple departments and also from multiple stakeholders. So for example, any citizen group can prepare a lake visioning document and go to the department particularly and say that this is already been collated. So now maybe whatever the funds are coming towards the rejuvenation of lakes can go towards this lake because there's already a high demand of it, and that lake visioning document itself can be then inputted inside the RFP, which also like tells exactly what are the eligibility criteria of the people who are going to do this kind of work, and what are the kind of checklist that each expert has to make sure that it is there. So whoever is the PMU sitting in the department looking at the rejuvenation of the lake, they will basically be checking these checklists, and it's basically streamlined. It's accessible to everyone. So it's a very black and white process. Like everybody knows exactly if this is the desired thing that has to happen, is it happening or not. So everybody just has the process in their hand. They have the checklist in their hand, and everybody knows exactly what is the next stage. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Thanks for answering that. For the next question, focuses on how GIS is being used in the advanced monitoring and evaluation. Deepthi, would you like to take that up?
I think Rashmi, would you like to answer that part regarding the catchment risk and the hydrology?
Yeah, so I mean, there are two places where we are using GIS. One is, of course, the diagnosis and visioning part. But I think because you asked M&E, since we have created these checklists both for the assets as well as for the lake characteristics, we've also put a column saying, okay, these because a lot of the observation stuff would be done by citizens, where they can make observations of, okay, what is the condition of the asset, or what are the characteristics that are present at the lake, visual characteristics. You can also take pictures of it and give your which have GIS, which have your lat long as well as your timestamps attached with the pictures. So you know, okay, where exactly the asset is placed, or where exactly in the lake would you see a issue. For example, if you have harmful algae in certain locations, or fish kill, which part, it could be specifically at the inlet or the outlet, and you could sort of put locations of that. As well as in the advanced monitoring stage, where you would be taking the sampling samples at the different locations, like Deepthi was mentioning. Along with the frequency, you would also be mentioning what are the different places that you would be taking, whether it's at the inlet, it's at the lake body, or at the outlet. So you can take a GIS location, which would be tagged along with your monitoring data. So that way you would know which part of the lake has what quality of data, because that would also vary from the inlet to the outlet. And just to clarify one of the other things, I think I'm looking at the other question, it's sort of going with that, because all of the checklists that we were showing through the presentation, we are trying to convert that into a tool where you could use it like an app, where you could just input your data directly into it, and all of this would be connected, all the different stages of the process that we mentioned, or it will be visible either on the tool itself or in a dashboard. This is still in process. What we have presented is just the idea of how it should be looking, but that is something we are trying to work towards in the next phase.
Yeah, thank you, Rashmi. For the next question, if a lake is located near an industrial area, there is a potential risk of heavy metal contamination. So, what design parameters or considerations should be taken into account to assess and manage this risk effectively?
So in terms of industrial pollutants entering the lake, this is also scoped out of the framework for obvious reasons, like you've already mentioned in the question. One aspect is to really look at the point of generation and ensure that that doesn't happen. But as we know, it does. And when that's the case, really, it's then intercepting, diverting, having particular treatment steps in the switch in the treatment plant itself, so that it addresses particular heavy metals that are detected in the influent. Now, depending on the type of industry is located in the catchment, you have different heavy metals, sometimes even agricultural runoff constituting of pesticides coming in. So it's really about intercepting these, being able to treat them in particular steps of a treatment plant, and then allowing the water to get into the lake, because otherwise the efficiency of for certain constructed wetlands, for certain plant species, for uptake is also quite limited. So the point of our approach to managing the water quality itself is to be able to complement one with the other. Where it's possible, we do use nature-based solutions. We use wetlands that can be implemented within the lake itself. But sometimes when the load coming in is just that much more higher, and it's a persistent load that's coming in because the industry is really located in the catchment, then you look at a more conventional or sometimes even advanced methods of treatment, particularly targeting heavy metals that come towards the end or after the secondary phase is done. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Deepthi. For the next question, we're focusing on are there any revenue generating models for lake assets that have you explored?
So the thing is, the framework is more about the process of lake rejuvenation, and because we have kind of consolidate the approach of breaking it down into the assets, so it's much easier for each CSR donor to come and only provide funding for that particular asset. So we also, so in this is already happening, that each funder is coming and only investing for one of the assets, but through the framework, because where we are doing the lake visioning process of it, this is where we are actually not letting it go, into broken terms. It's basically not fragmented. So we have the larger vision. To achieve that larger vision, because we have these certain assets, so each funder will be able to only fund for that particular thing. And because the whole lake visioning document goes towards the department itself, it goes towards the BBMP lake department, so they already know what is the requirement, requirement. It doesn't need to be have to be proven or kind of like made out like why we need this kind of an asset. So it's also easier to transfer the funds toward that particular intervention then. But we have not particularly looked at how lakes can be like generating revenue models or not.
Got it, got it. For the next question, I think I'll just combine the other one as well with this. Is there a minimum size that a lake should be to go through this exercise to make it viable? And the second one focuses on, I think the audience wants to know if there is any case study where this lake rejuvenation framework has been applied. Yeah.
So what we have said is the maximum depth for scoping of this work right now. We have said that all lakes that are below 6 meters would sort of follow similar principles in terms of how they behave. We haven't given a minimum amount, minimum size or depth values for these lakes. The other one. The other question was about, could you repeat that?
If it's applied anywhere, the framework.
Oh, so what we're trying to do is right now try to apply, because we are also working on a project in a place called Chintamani, which is slightly north of Bangalore. It is a town in Karnataka, and they also have similar problems, but it's a peri-urban area. It's not as urbanized as Bangalore, and we are rejuvenating a lake along with Friends of Lakes and India Care Foundation, and we're trying to apply that because it's still in the rejuvenation process right now. We're trying to apply the framework there and see does it work or not. And because the lot of the framework development was also done along with Friends of Lakes, who have been actively working in and around Bangalore in with government departments, so they know what is the on-ground practical application of how things work. So because there's a lot of things which which we were looking at scientifically, even in the diagnosis process, or even in the designing process of or monitoring process for that matter. Like what are the things that we need to take into consideration, but that may not be practically applicable. So for those, we really got input from lake groups like Friends of Lake, who have conducted this in the past on urban lakes.
Sure. Thanks, Rashmi, for sharing that. And the next question focuses on who should have the onus for the monitoring and evaluation. The custodians of the lake comprised of citizens, government, and technical experts. And should this be available on a public dashboard to further inform operation and maintenance projects in a transparent and accountable way?
Yeah, as Deepthi already mentioned that there are two stages of monitoring that we are looking at. One is the basic stage and then the advanced stage. So for the basic stage of we want to give the custodianship to the people who are around the lake, who are affected by the lake, and they will do the visual aspects of it. But any critical issue that is happening has to go towards the custodians of the lake, that is your department who is going to look into it. The financial part of it can come from any source, but the actual monitoring of the technical issues that are happening in the lake should go to the custodians of the lake, which is your government departments. And yes, it should be available on the public dashboard, because we look forward to having many more lake vision documents on all the lakes of Bangalore being on public dashboards, so people are also able to assess like what's happening in and around the lake. So similarly, if something has already been done, the money has already went in their neighborhood lake. So people should be able to see how has the lake been operating, what really goes into the monitoring of it.
Sure. I think we'll take up the last question now. Um, we have one more question in chat. So, do you have any ballpark numbers for the amount required per acre or per KLD of water for the rejuvenation of lakes, focusing on the water quality part?
I think right now, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't think we really have estimates offhand. I'm sure we can get back to our team and revert back to you. But just off the cuff, I mean, I don't really have it. I don't know, Rashmi, Anam.
Yeah. So in like one of the lakes that we was working on previously, so we looked at uh, only some 500 KLD of water coming into a DWAT system. So that DWAT system required around some 300 square feet of area around the inside the lake boundary. And just to for the cost of implementation was around 50 lakhs for just 500 KLD of water that was coming. The BOD here was around 150 that we were receiving from one of the inlets. So this is just some one ballpark figure that we have for just the water quality aspect. And then if you go for constructed wetland, it is much cheaper, like around 15 to 20,000 rupees can be a wetland can be achieved at least in 100 square feet area.
Yeah, I think, and the number would vary based on like what kind of intervention you're bringing in. Based on like what if this is the function you wanted to play, and this is the current state versus what is the desired state. Based on that, the level of intervention you would require would change, and that would change the cost. So it could be really low loading, and you don't require a huge investment versus you have raw sewage coming in, which would require something like an STP, which is much more expensive.
I think just the last question before we close. What are the KPIs to report the impact created through the lake rejuvenation?
So one is the scale that we presented. We can also take a look at it on the website. But essentially, to be able to integrate aspects of the lake characteristics itself across hydrology, biology, and chemistry. And the scale itself plays an important role in capturing chemical aspects or the aspects related to lake chemistry that also have strong linkages to biology or how well the lake is doing, what the lake's current health is. So that's what we're proposing. And Rashmi's just put it up on chat. So I hope you take a look.
Thank you again for these responses, and a big thank you to everyone who have submitted the questions. It's actually been a great engagement. And before we wrap up, I'd like to ask, would any of you like to share a final takeaway or recommendation to the audience, something to keep in mind as they think about applying this framework within their own cities or contexts?
I mean, thank you, Shaurya, for hosting us. I think it was really nice for us to be able to share it through the India Forum for NbS. Um, I think the takeaway for me, and really what I have taken away as being part of this project, is to be able to integrate well and to be able to align incentives for community aspirations, but also keeping at the back of your head what fundamental science says, what's possible, and really the larger role that lakes can play in our cities, in our neighborhoods, and really in their own catchments. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepthi. Thank you, Rashmi. And thank you, Anam, so much for the presentation. Before we close today's session, we'd really appreciate your quick feedback through an interactive Mentimeter poll. This will help us better plan our upcoming masterclasses. So please do scan the QR code. It should only take a minute or two. And on behalf of the India Forum for Nature-Based Solutions, thank you again to our speakers and to everyone who joined us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation and collaboration around restoring our lakes, not just as water bodies, but as living systems that really shape the future of our cities. Have a great rest of the evening, and see you all at the next masterclass.